Hey everybody, I know that I've been out of the game for a bit, but I just had a recent conversation about the man, the legend, the alt-right neo-Nazi toxically masculine misogynist racist, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. It kind of inspired some digging on my part to look into the man, his politics, his criticisms, and his affiliations. I've stated in previous videos that I'm fairly familiar with Peterson's work and therefore was a bit surprised when, during a discussion, Peterson was effectively lumped in with the alt-right and saw that many of the things that he has said were taken out of context. Then I realized that the buddy I was talking to seemed to be reading articles from the mainstream media about Peterson rather than getting information from the source, like Peterson's YouTube channel or any of the various interviews or debates that Peterson's taken part in since his rise to fame. And so we're going to get into some of these articles and see why my buddy thinks that Jordan Peterson is an alt-right hyper-conservative fascist. So, following some research into the mainstream media's perception of Jordan Peterson, there appears to be, overall, a blatant and ongoing smear campaign regarding this man and his ideas. I'm not going to get into each and every article, but the common themes throughout them tend to lend themselves to character attacks rather than a discussion of ideas. Links in the description for your viewing pleasure. For example, many of these publications seem to be making an honest effort to ensure that Dr. Peterson gets lumped in with kind of provocative individuals and groups like Milo Yiannopoulos or Mike Cernovich or Alex Jones, the incels movement or the Gamergate movement. You know, a lot of these publications seem to be bringing all of these things up. You know, you pick an article and one of these people is probably named in it. And it seems to me that these associations are being used to kind of diminish the credibility of Peterson's ideas by placing him in the same category as provocateurs, conspiracy theorists, misogynists, and trolls, thereby instantly denigrating Peterson's overall character in the reader's mind. And that's a pretty shady psychological trick that journalists have been pulling for a long, long time when they want to discredit someone or lump them into a specific group. And, you know, the reverse kind of works too. They'll lump somebody they like in with good people or make good associations. However, these associations are not nearly as severe as when these publications evoke images of Nazis and other types of fascist sentiments. You know, and I've seen some publications outright call Jordan Peterson a Nazi or a white nationalist or directly compare him to white supremacists like Richard Spencer. Some individuals have even gone so far as to directly compare Peterson to Hitler, as seen in the Lindsay Tribunal. And by my estimation, these are really tall claims for which I've honestly been able to find no real evidence for. And in fact, from what I've seen, based on Peterson's own words, he appears to be decidedly opposed to far-right identitarians. And I'll get into more on that in a minute. These mainstream publications seem to have a slew of other commonalities, of which the authors quite clearly do not have a foundational understanding, such as Peterson's interests in social hierarchies or the disenfranchised state of men and masculinity in this country right now, his campaign against the radical left without much word on the radical right, and that last point I'll get into in a little bit. But first, who is Dr. Peterson? What do we know about this man that is factually true? Well, we know that he's a highly published and cited doctor of clinical psychology. He's a tenured professor at the University of Toronto, and up until recently, he operated a private clinical practice. Peterson also appears to be an avid student of Carl Jung, often relating situations, groups, and individuals to his listeners in terms of historical archetypal incarnations, with a focus on internal psychological dualities and conflicts. So, why is anybody talking about Jordan Peterson? Well, aside from publishing video recordings of his lectures for more than 2 decades, Peterson was kind of catapulted into the mainstream focus for, best of my estimation, 2 things. First, he released a commentary on how universities in the West are radicalizing students to engage in far-left ideological activism. And then the Canadian government passed legislation that added transgendered and gender nonconforming individuals to a list of protected groups by means of Canadian Bill C-16. And this bill kind of came with the implication that refusal to use the preferred pronouns for members of these groups could possibly amount to hate crime and therefore result in legal action. And Dr. Peterson vocally opposed this bill, claiming that the government was making an effort to compel his speech. And therefore, supporters of the bill lambasted him as transphobic and labeled him a right-wing reactionary. And in the years since, Peterson's kind of built a career of speaking out against the narratives of what he refers to as postmodern neo-Marxism growing on the political left, specifically pointing out the radicalization of college students. And Dr. Peterson appears to fear that if these ideas are not beaten back, that Western society is headed to a type of Stalinist future of thought crime and gulags. Furthermore, Peterson's published an international bestseller that effectively amounts to a self-help regimen that's intended to help individuals take account of their actions, take responsibility, and get their life together. And the media pieces I mentioned earlier often paint Peterson's tone and role in these instances as a type of father figure for primarily disenfranchised white men who are having trouble existing in a world that appears to increasingly hate them. And it's through this notion especially that Peterson appears to have gathered a kind of steadily growing, very loyal following that some have referred to as a sort of personality cult. I won't comment on that here, but I do find it particularly interesting how undeniably loyal this following is. But anyway, we've heard what the media has to say about Peterson's politics. I've had a little bit of my commentary, so let's hear it from the man himself.
He wrote back and said, "Thank you for your response. So the article is truthful and accurate. How would you like to be characterized?" I said very clearly, "You mischaracterized me as far right. On what grounds whatsoever can you make that claim? And having made it, it is your responsibility to either justify the characterization with some investigation or to withdraw it and apologize. Politically, I'm a classic British liberal. Temperamentally, I'm high in openness, which tilts me to the left, although I am also conscientious, which tilts me to the right. Philosophically, I am an individualist, not a collectivist of the right or the left. Metaphysically, I'm an American pragmatist who has been strongly influenced by the psychoanalytic and clinical thinking of Freud, Jung, and the psychotherapists who have followed in their wake. There is simply nothing I have said or done that makes me far right. Quite the contrary, I've warned thousands of students over the course of 3 decades that the spirit of Auschwitz concentration camp guards dwells in their heart, and that they should do everything in their power to recognize its existence and overcome it. Every single lecture of my Maps of Meaning course, various versions which have now been watched or listened to by millions of people, make some variant of that point. I've also produced a series of individual self-development programs now used by thousands of people to strengthen themselves as individuals, determine their proper and honorable destinies, and live productive, meaningful lives."
Now, I personally see no reason to not take Peterson at his word when it comes to his political leanings. It would appear to me that he is, overall, a center-left liberal who's kind of deeply concerned with the effect that the extreme left is having on society, and the sheer amount of control that they appear to have over mainstream discourse right now. However, I've heard other people claim that don't listen to what he says, you have to watch his behavior, and it's clear that he's a right-wing conservative, particularly when it comes to his traditional views on marriage, sex roles, and the hierarchical nature of humans, and certain religious viewpoints. But now that we're all cozy and established in the overall narrative, I got some of my own commentary on Dr. Peterson and his political views. Me personally, I do not believe that Peterson is right-wing or conservative really at all. Maybe the argument can be made for a couple of his stances on a couple of key issues, but overall I do not believe that he's right-wing. I feel like he's a moderate liberal that focuses very much on individual responsibility. However, I feel like this type of, quote, centrist liberalism now appears right-wing to many people on the left. And I believe that's in no small part due to the idea that the acceptable narrative for left-wingers has moved so far to the left that anything to the right of socialist is now considered conservative or right-wing. With this in mind, it's becoming increasingly more difficult for me to believe anyone when they throw the accusation, and it is an accusation, that someone is alt-right. It basically amounts to heretic at this point. And so the categorization means absolutely nothing anymore. And for a while it was synonymous with, quote, white supremacist or ethno-nationalist. But when everyone who disagrees with any part of the far-left narrative is alt-right, the word completely loses its meaning. It turns out that words have to mean things to have any real effect. Funny that. And I'll be doing a video on how words mean things in the future. But I digress. Let's take a look at Dr. Peterson's response to the alt-right question when someone asks him directly. And there are quite a few of them if you look, and to me, Peterson appears to pretty much dislike the far right in equal measure to the far left. But here's a short bit from a relatively recent H3 podcast.
How do you feel? I know that people make this association with you because I've seen it when we have guests come on. We have a thread on our subreddit and people post their questions, and I've seen it before. People associate you with pandering to like white supremacists, or worse. I've even seen the suggestion that you are a white supremacist yourself. So how do you feel about that? And that seems to be like a somewhat widely held.
Well, I don't know what to think
opinion.
about that. It's completely ridiculous. Like, for example, I'm an honorary member of a Native American tribe. I got inducted last year. I have an Indian name, a Native American name. Like, it's completely preposterous. And I've been buying carvings from this like isolated tribe in northern Vancouver on northern Vancouver Island for 15 years, and so, and I've had it's preposterous. And I mean, there's evidence that it's preposterous, and the evidence is that I have 260 videos on YouTube, and they must total at least 600 hours, something like that. And, by now people have been over them essentially with a fine-tooth comb. Virtually everything I've said in my classes to my students in the last 25 years is on video. And so if there was anything in there that was even remotely associated with that, it would come out. But it's even worse than that, because it's actually the opposite. Because the reason I've been teaching students since 1993 about the Holocaust and what happened in the Soviet Union, and I've been trying to make them understand how that's associated with the unwillingness to accept personal responsibility, and educating them as deeply as I can about the horrors of exactly that sort of thing. Like, it's obsessed me ever since I was very, very young. And so not only is it not true, it's anti-true. It's seriously untrue.
Now, many people criticize individuals and commentators like Jordan Peterson for almost exclusively attacking the radical left and more or less ignoring the radical right, who are often viewed as more reprehensible and a bigger threat. But personally, I think this criticism comes from a tribal place, where individuals can't seem to dissociate someone attacking, quote, my group from being a member of the enemy group. However, if you look at the alt-right neo-Nazis or white supremacists, it's pretty clear that their viewpoints are absolutely not acceptable in the mainstream. I mean, in fact, they're kind of laughable in the wider scope of society. They're a meme. And people, by and large, simply find these types of people absolutely reprehensible. However, the far-right fascists are most definitely a spectacle. When they do things, they do them big. A giant burning swastika or murder by car definitely grab headlines and are absolutely irredeemable. But it gets clicks. However, I believe that Dr. Peterson and others with a similar type of commentary simply don't see the far right as a credible threat to democratic liberty. A line of demarcation has been drawn between socially acceptable conservative values and the extremes of the far right ideology. And I think people like Dr. Peterson feel that it's extremely important the line be drawn on the far left as well. Because as bad as Nazis were, historically, state-implemented communism and socialism have caused more state-sanctioned death than the Nazis by a wide margin. And that's demonstrable. We know this to be true. Anyway, now that we have a firm grasp of what I perceive Jordan Peterson's views are, I'll offer up my criticisms of some of the issues he addresses and some of the positions that he takes. Firstly, as a student of psychology myself, I don't particularly care for Peterson's love of Carl Jung, or the overarching archetypes that he uses, the symbolic interpretations, or the religious allegories. You know, to me, Jung's theories overall were a good jumping off point for relating commonalities among stories that exist interculturally, but I've always kind of felt that they're a bit like horoscopes. You know, you could say a housewife makes breakfast for her kids, and that's the nurturing earth mother. You know, a leader makes a good decision, that's the wise king. A man beats his kids, that's the tyrannical father, the patriarch, you know, and so on. You can do this all day. And if you present a story or a character, you can sort of shoehorn that character into any number of these archetypal roles, or you can relate it back to some other more ancient story. You know, this is kind of where I think the biblical stories come from. But furthermore, in my opinion, with more modern iterations of kind of aggregate personality psychology, like the Big Five or the MBTI, I feel like Jung's contributions should academically be viewed as more of kind of a stepping stone or a foundation to modern methods rather than a modern method itself. However, this doesn't mean that I believe that archetypal metaphor or allegory is totally without merit or utility. You know, when an academic is interacting with a layman, is it more effective for this psychologist to explain the science and dynamics of interactions through the use of behavioral intervention, or to explain with an easy-to-relate story that anyone who's watched a Disney movie can understand? You know, it has its uses. But I see Dr. Peterson utilize this kind of method of the archetype metaphor to pretty good effect really often, particularly when he's referring to the difficulties that young men face in Western society, or to kind of, you know, explain a point that he's making in a different way. But to me, it kind of gets muddied, because I also notice that Peterson falls into a trap that I've seen many academics fall into, where the academic understands the philosophical and empirical foundations upon which his claims lie, but academics then make statements based on those foundations that no one around them really seems to understand. You know, for example, when Peterson mentions that disenfranchised young men would benefit from a system of, quote, enforced monogamy, I personally understand that he's referring to a culture that encourages marriages and monogamy, as opposed to our current system of a sort of free love mentality that came out of the 60s. And you know, I could do hours of video on the science that Peterson's referring to with this claim. However, I understand the sentiment because I've spent damn near 10 years studying the sexual preferences and social dynamics and social consequences of romantic and sexual relationships. So, the average person is probably most definitely not quite as specialized in that regard. And therefore, they're going to take his comment at face value. They're not going to take the time or expend the energy to study sexual dimorphism, you know. So you get things like the enforced monogamy comments and Peterson's sympathy towards, you know, downtrodden young male communities such as the incel community that have left him appearing as a sort of misogynistic traditionalist when it comes to men and relationships. However, I feel that these claims just don't have a clear understanding of the foundation upon which Peterson builds his arguments. You know, it appears to me that Peterson's more concerned with this problem due to the notion that women in society civilize men, on average, rather than men should have women.
A harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. And you know, you also see that, like one of the central female stories, let's say, if the hero archetype is the central male story, there are variants of hero archetypes that are relevant to women, and one of them is Beauty and the Beast. And you know, Beauty isn't interested in the guy who isn't the beast. She's interested in the guy who's the beast. And that's exactly right. But she's interested in the guy who's the beast that can be civilized and disciplined, right? And who can use that in the service, well, let's say, of a family. And that's exactly, well, that's exactly how it should be.
So, to me, that clip kind of lays it out there like women taking the role of civilizing men, taking the beast and making sure that he directs his bestial nature towards something productive and good is a very important part of society. You know, and that is my interpretation of it. And again, there he used the archetype of a very old story and kind of made it kind of digestible in a way. And I find it pretty interesting. But overall, my best recommendation would be to investigate Dr. Peterson's viewpoints for yourself if you haven't already jumped down that rabbit hole. And I would say to do this by watching his interviews or his lectures or his YouTube channel, rather than have them explained to you through, third party by a journalist. And I assure you that something gets lost in the translation. The media smear campaign against him baffles me to no small degree following the research that I've done into the man, but I have to wonder if the root bases of this campaign lie less in malice and more in a type of layman's ignorance of the academic foundations of his arguments and his philosophies. So, to answer the titular question, is Jordan Peterson alt-right? The answer, in my opinion, is a definitive no. I think that's where I'll end it on this particular topic. You guys know the deal. Give me some likes, subscribe to the channel. If you like the cut of my jib, yell at me in the comments down below, and I'll try to get another one out next week.